So the session that we have today is called "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly: Latest Trends on the Dark Web." So I'll hand it over to you for you to chat with the rest of the guys that you have on the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Yes, it's a real challenge, good, bad, and ugly. And with a little luck, we'll spend a good time analyzing the ugly trends, but end, if we can, with some kind of upbeat message. It's a real pleasure to help introduce, shepherd some great commentators and some of the leading thinkers and researchers working on the problems of the dark web. We have Britton is joining us from his offices in the FBI. He specializes in the analysis of cyber and criminal activities, especially as they relate to national security issues in the US. And he helps evaluate how the FBI as an office reacts to such threats. We've got Evanna Hu, CEO of Omelas, and of course a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, certainly one of the leading public intellectuals working on the problem of misinformation in public life. Geoff White is an investigative journalist who's worked for a number of outlets and has an exciting new book, crime.com, coming out in August. I expect we'll all be emotionally exhausted by this topic over the next hour, but I'm looking forward to crime.com. I know how hard it is to write about these things because the trends move so quick. So having it on the dockets for August is going to be very valuable. And then we also have James Chappell, founder of a firm called Digital Shadows. He's been investigating the dark side of national and corporate misinformation, dirty tricks for several years, and will be able to tell us a little bit about what he's working on and thinking about now. As we go around to our colleagues, I've asked them each to think about a story, a good story about what they're working on now, what's worrying them now. And for myself, I thought I'd offer a quick sum up of what my latest book is about and how I got started, and perhaps the big surprise that still leaves me surprised. If we could call up the quick Prezi that I could have, I want to offer a summary and a link and a discount code, just in case anybody's actually interested in the title and the book by the end. The book is called Lie Machines, and it just came out this month. And the reason I started working on it a couple of years ago was because of a crisis that happened in the summer of 2014 when I was living in Budapest. Some of you may remember that's the summer that the Malaysian Airlines flight was shot down over Ukraine. And I found that my Hungarian friends were getting multiple kinds of ridiculous stories from Russian origins about why the flight was shot down. The first story was that American troops had shot the flight down, and that they were trying to get at Putin, who was flying commercial from Amsterdam to Malaysia. The second story was that democracy advocates in Ukraine had shot the flight down. The third story, my favorite far and away, was the story of the lost tank from World War II that came out of the forests of Ukraine, confused, and accidentally shot the plane down. And it was at this point that I realized the strategy of misinformation, especially for the Russians in particular, is not so much about creating one narrative that your opponents can respond to, but about creating multiple conflicting, equally ridiculous narratives that make it hard for anybody to respond in a constructive way. Now, what's really surprised me over the last couple of years, and this is what I go into in the book, is how this misinformation strategy has gone from being something that dictators use on their own people to being something that ruling elites in authoritarian regimes do to voters in the West, to now being something that political leaders in the West do to their own voters, and white supremacists and ultranationalists. So there's been this domestication of a disinformation strategy that's the thing that's really been bugging me. So the book is called Lie Machines. I'm going to toss it to our colleague Britton in a second. It's from Yale University Press. 30% off if you're interested in why lies is the discount code the publishers publisher's website. So I'm happy to say more during Q&A if it's of interest, but let's turn to the good conversation we can have now and start with Britton. Maybe say a little bit about where you are, although in your case, I think we can tell, and what you're working on. Britton.
Sure. Britton Boyd from the FBI El Paso office, where I'm the assistant special agent in charge over the intelligence branch, where we're responsible for analyzing trends, national security trends, cyber trends, and criminal analysis. And we use that information to identify emerging threats and reallocate resources based on the information and the analysis done in the intelligence branch. Phil, I thought it was pretty interesting what you were talking about, the propaganda and misinformation and things like that on the internet. I was at our counter terrorism division during the ISIS propaganda blitz, and interestingly enough, as internet service providers, social media sites started self-censoring a lot of that propaganda being used to push the ISIS message, the extremist message. There was a general concern that a lot of that messaging would potentially go to the dark web in order to avoid a lot of the censoring that was going on during that time to thwart ISIS extremist activity. But one of the interesting things that we saw and recognized is that the dark web is not a good platform for that, because people using propaganda such as nation states, dictators, extremist organizations, the dark web does not reach the masses easily enough, and it doesn't serve their intended purposes for getting that message out. So I think that is one thing that we were initially concerned about regarding the dark web and propaganda use amongst extremists, but it didn't bear out due to their inability to get that message out to the masses. One of the things we have seen is cataloging of extremist videos and propaganda there, but again, you have to go on to the dark net to look for that. And most of the people in the United States or other countries just don't widely use it a whole lot. I think one of the interesting things we're seeing right now on the dark web is because of how much it's showing up in movies, television, media, people writing about it, talking about it. You do see a lot more people just going onto it for curiosity's sake. In my personal opinion, I think there are a lot of really interesting tools. The dark web in and of itself is a very interesting technological feat, but like many tools, it could be a great tool, but it depends on what it's being used for. And a lot of the activity that we're seeing on the dark web, not necessarily for good purposes, but people selling stolen data and trade secrets. People are selling malware on there. And so when people are going on to the dark web, you don't just get there accidentally. It's a thoughtful choice to go there. And typically, many of the people we're seeing go there are going there for those illicit purposes. One of the big reasons is that, or not one of the biggest reasons, but people are going there for child pornography, buying drugs. And so due to the technology and technological developments from a law enforcement perspective, people are going there to obfuscate themselves and make themselves harder to track. So it's a very difficult investigative environment. Trends are always changing, technology is always changing. And so investigators have to do a very good job at adapting to the latest trends and technology that are being used there on the dark web by the criminals. from privacy perspective, one could make the argument that, you know what, I'm going onto the dark web to search for things because I don't want to use Google. 99% of the population or another large internet site, 99% of the population like me, every time my phone doesn't update, I click accept terms, and these tech companies are harvesting a tremendous amount of personal data that we willingly give up for the convenience of using this technology. And there are a small percentage of people who are going onto the dark web to avoid some of this privacy, but in reality, it's slow, it's not convenient, and so it's not necessarily a good alternative for the World Wide Web as we know it. So that's why so much of that activity we see on there is criminal in nature. So one of the things that I'm seeing and that I'm pretty excited about from an FBI perspective is our outreach that we've been doing with our public and private partners from the private sector, because it's such a huge field and so much going on. There's no way the FBI can reasonably investigate everything going on there. And people have the misconception that from TV and media that these investigations, we can find perpetrators in 30 minutes with a couple of clicks of the button, and that's just not the case. So through our engagement with private sector, we're working with other companies who are leaning forward and getting into that space, looking for stolen data, looking for people who have identified backdoors into their technology to steal data or trade secrets, which can then be sold on these dark web markets. And it's very hard to identify who's stealing it, who's selling it. And so through that public-private sector relationship, we're able to share information from the private industry who's out there doing their own investigation and intelligence gathering, so to speak, so that when things are identified, we can then do the criminal investigations and work that through the justice system. But these groups are also set up so that they can share amongst each other. So if Corporation X discovers a data breach for Corporation A, they can share that information while they're sharing it with us to plug up the holes that people have identified by leaning into that dark space through their own intelligence groups.
That totally makes sense. It's also collaboration is also totally necessary for research to figure out what's going on. So I can see how the collaboration between the FBI and industry is vital to stamping up the big problems. I want to open to the panel. Does anybody want to ask Britton a question and start a conversation before we turn to Evanna?
Just a very quick one from me, Britton. Thank you for that. It was fascinating. One of the interesting challenges we have is that society is digitized, and so too is crime, and the proliferation of crime is increasing at quite a rate of knots. How do you think sort of the FBI is approaching this sort of growth in digital crime? How is it being resourced in this sort of background to a growing problem?
Right, great question. One of the things that we're doing is we are actively recruiting people with the cyber background, and the people we are hiring, we are putting them into training programs so that they are continually learning the newest trends, what's happening, and trying to get in front of the threat. And oftentimes that's very difficult given how quick technology changes. Which is why those public-private sector partnerships are so important, so that we can then leverage industry resources for people who might become aware of things before we do. And so that partnership we have is is critical to what we do.
I wanted to ask a question of Britton. I thought that was fascinating. I wonder, in this private partnership working that you've got, obviously in a lot of occasions you're going to be pulling in the same direction, but is it always smooth sailing? Surely there are times when the private companies and what they're after doing, the commercial drive they've got, might be conflicting with the sort of public service side. Does that happen? And if so, how does it manifest itself?
Right. So I think it's two different things, right? You're talking about two separate things. What I'm talking about is, for instance, is the InfraGard organization, which is a organization that brings in private sector, utility companies, technology companies, banks, anybody who has data to protect or is on the internet and trying to do their job. That is an organization that you're joining that organization because you want to share with each other. You want to get ahead of the threat. I think what you're talking about is companies who have developed encryption, so to speak, and are selling their brand based on their ability to be encrypted and you can't intercept them. So that becomes a conversation, for instance, when you have a crime and you know that the evidence to solve that crime is on a phone that might be encrypted or in a chat being discussed in a platform that's encrypted. That becomes a conversation between a company is, will you allow us to provide us that information to solve this crime or prevent a terrorist attack, or will you not? And so I think that is the back and forth tug between companies and government regarding how much access we will have to something.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question, or are you looking for something more specific?
No, that's interesting. Yeah. Oh.
So there's
Phil is on mute, right?
Yeah, Phil, we can't hear you at the moment.
Okay.
But you can. How's this?
That's better.
Perfect.
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to pitch to Evanna. Tell us a good story. Tell us what you're thinking about or what you're worried about.
Okay. I'm going to start my story on the good side of the dark web. And so the first time I actually started using the dark web extensively, it was back in 2010 or 2011, and it was a way for me to communicate with the leaders of the Arab Spring and other leaders of movements of democracy or freedom. And they were obviously very concerned about their safety as they were living in countries under authoritarian regimes. And so we used the dark web to really try to communicate with each other, but mostly it was actually for file sharing. At the time, pastebin and all these things didn't really exist, where there were a lot of kinks with it. And so we just decided to use the dark web. And it didn't really seem like it was out of the ordinary, just because in that world, everybody was using Tor and PGP. And it felt really safe, right? Like I knew that the Silk Road was a thing back then, but didn't really think too much of the dark web being used for nefarious purposes. And that was not until I got, for my day job, got pulled into the anti-ISIS work. And so this was 2015. I was in Sulaymaniyah when ISIS was marching across Iraq. It was about 50 kilometers away from Erbil. And we were all frantically trying to better understand what they were using technology-wise to spread their propaganda and for recruitment. And for a while, they were, of course, on your typical social media platforms, but then they got kicked off. And then they all flooded to the dark web, as Britton mentioned before, and encrypted apps. But what we saw was a little bit different, which was that they were not really using the dark web for mass propaganda, because you basically have to kind of be in the know to know where to go. And so their methodology was adapted to a fairly simple process. So step one, they singled out the individuals that they thought had the most potential or watched a sermon the most amount of times, right, on the surface web. And then the communication would then be carried off the surface web to an encrypted app like Telegram or Ask.fm or any one of those. And once they have semi-radicalized them, they said, hey, go to this website on the dark web where you can watch more Alaki sermons or whatever it was at the time. And that's how a lot of people actually ended up. If you think about recruitment as kind of a sales funnel, they ended up at the end of the sales funnel, like on the dark web. And then what we also saw from an anti-money laundering perspective was that the dark web became a marketplace for terrorist groups to sell goods so that they could keep on fundraising. So if you stole stuff from Palmyra, you can't just go out to, any one of the respectable auction houses and say, hey, I stole this from Palmyra, I would like to sell it. So they did it on the dark web. And so fast forward to a couple years to what I'm doing now, which is taking a lot of my experience from looking at messaging and how do we actually prevent people from joining terrorist groups into messaging of state actors. And, we talk a lot about what's going on right now in terms of disinfo. And something that has been really disturbing for us in the disinfo space is this idea of disinformation as a service, or DaaS, sort of like a SaaS model that you can buy from Dropbox or wherever. And it's this notion that there are some really, really good disinfo people out there who used to work for the Russian government or who used to be mercenaries for the IRA. And they've basically taken their expertise and they're now marketing it on the dark web to private sector companies, saying, hey, if you want to smear your competitor, this is how, we'll do it for you at $68 per word. Or, hey, if you want to promote your company to artificially pump up the stock prices of a real legitimate company, we're going to write a piece for you for $8,260, and it will be published in Reuters, right? Which is also a very legitimate newswire. And when you sit down and really think about it, you're like, crap, like it's really cheap. Disinformation is really, really cheap. And now you can go and hire someone to do it on the dark web. And so where do we actually go from here, right? Like, what does that actually mean for the internet as a whole? And what does it actually mean for the dark web? Tor was created by the US Navy a long time ago, but now has become a community project. And whenever we're talking to government officials, not just in the US, but we do a lot of training in the Middle East and Africa, the first question we always get when we talk about the dark web is, A, can we turn it off? And then they go a step further and they ask, actually, can we just turn off the entire internet? Which like governments do all the time, but it is not a long-term solution. And so what I'm really concerned about, especially around disinformation services on the dark web is, what is the truth and what is the reality? And that in itself is a psychological operation. Is if you make everything seem like they're not real, or that you're going to view everything with distrust, then who do you actually trust?
Mm-hmm. Yes, great and tough question. What do you think? Other people have an answer to that? Who do you
Yes, disinformation as a service. I thought that was fantastic. It's not a phrase I've heard before. I did wonder, in terms of those services that are being offered, if, for example, they're charging $8,000 to get a piece on Reuters, I'd want to know which pieces on Reuters have they placed. I'd kind of want the evidence. And this is slightly a problem, isn't it, on the dark web generally? There's a lot of offers, and I'm never quite sure which ones are actual, who's going to actually deliver. Is it possible to divine that at all?
So we have conducted our own research, but there are also other companies out there like Record a Future that actually published a piece on like they made up a fake company and then approached various people on the dark web offering the disinfo service. And that's how, that monetary amount that I talked about, the $8,260 came about. It was basically the average of what was being offered. And they actually did have a lot of success, but ultimately they decided not to publish it because, you know, like you've done your experiment, you can't really go and harm this other thing. But it's really simple to almost, because now that everybody, you know, is a blogger where can put content online, and with the 24/7 service, like it's almost impossible for journalists to do fact check every single time for every single article. And so a good example is in Ukraine. So this is something that a member of parliament of Ukraine told me. He used to represent Donbass, and he said, you know, a lot of reporters are lazy, and so instead of fact checking, they just go on LiveJournal. And Russia realized that LiveJournal was still being used, so then they were just flooded with fake news that then would be picked up by legitimate reporters, who then, because they're legitimate Ukrainian reporters, then Western media would, you know, pick up on that and publish it in the New York Times or Washington Post. And then Russia would then retweet that Washington Post article saying, it's not us saying it, right? It's a legitimate article written by a Western media newspaper. Like, and so that becomes this like cycle that's incredibly hard to break.
Evanna, I have a question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
So you highlighted one of the good things about social media, which is, or not social media, but the dark web, in that it enables groups to talk about political activities, which are protected First Amendment free speech things here in the US, but in other countries, they try and clamp down on that. And so you were able to talk back and forth with them about some of the things that were going on. But when you bring up the journalism example, the dark web and people passing you information, let's say leaked secrets or something that was stolen from a company that they want to out, how are you able to trust and verify the source of that information and what their intent is in giving it to you before it's used in media and journalism and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I have the answer to that. I think personally, for my own safety and things like that, what I do is it's actually probably something, you know, taught in intelligence, which is you triple verify everything. And I do that especially with people. And a lot of times what I also do is I will put out honey pots essentially out there to make sure that they're not posing as someone else. But ultimately, when it comes to, I think at the end of the day, for me, it's much more like a gut feeling and trusting the community around me. So like, who's the person who made that intro? Do I trust their judgment? And I have a lot of like people I work with who I will continue to work with, but when it comes to those type of things, I probably don't trust their judgment. And so if they connect me to someone like, I don't really know, so I'm gonna wait on that until, you know, I can go through the rest of my network to figure out whether or not this is legit. But I'm also just like extra cautious and probably more paranoid than the average person.
I think that's fair. One of the problems of working in this domain is that you get more paranoid as an investigator, as a researcher. Geoff, we have some things in common. I think we have different ethics guidelines for how you work as a journalist or how I work as an academic. For example, I'm not allowed to set out honeypots. I could see how that would be totally useful as a research skill, but we're not, as a research technique, but we're not allowed to do it. What are you thinking about, Geoff? What are you working on these days?
Well, it's interesting. The theme that's coming through loud and clear for me and that permeates this entire thing, the fault line running through it, is the issue of trust. And weirdly, I think that's been an issue since the beginning of the dark web. I mean, the architecture of the dark web is meant to operate in a zero trust environment. How can we get messages across the internet and not leak it to any parties along the way? And in terms of that trust issue, there's a couple of things that tie in with what both the previous speakers have talked about. We've seen this trust damaged on the dark web several key times. So there was Silk Road, the massive, mainly drug site that was busted. Ross Ulbricht was at the center of that, and he was the trust at the center of it. People trusted the person who ran that site. So when he got arrested, it damaged that trust. The next leap forward was Alphabay and Hansa. Alphabay was the biggest dark website at the time. Hansa was arguably number 2. The law enforcement, as Britton will well know, managed to infiltrate Alphabay and Hansa. They took Alphabay down. People went towards Hansa. They discovered Hansa. After a little while, they discovered that was a law enforcement honeypot as well. And that hugely damaged the trust on the dark web. And what's interesting is, in the wake of that, people have been asking this question. How, if I go on a dark website, can I trust anyone? How can I trust the people who own the site to keep my information, my transactions secure? And the answer is the encrypted apps. Because apps like Telegram, I'm going to mention Telegram because I know it quite well, but there are other obviously encrypted apps out there. Apps like Telegram remove the hands of the controller from the controls and say, look, we don't have a master key to all the communication. It's encrypted at both ends, so the only people who can read the communications are the sender and the recipient. But Telegram's a really interesting example because it goes one step further. Telegram's amazing because it combines the two things that people want to do illegally on the dark web. They want to publish their wares and they want to trade. And traditionally that was difficult because publishing it, you want as many people to know about it as possible. But when you want to do the trades, you want as few people to know about it as possible. Telegram offers people the opportunity to set out their wares and then privately in the encrypted section of the app to do the transaction to make the deal go down. And that seems to have sort of squared that trust circle for a lot of people. But the trust issue also comes up in the kind of disinformation and information management thing we've looked at. And again, the stuff that Evanna was talking about, I thought was fascinating because the objective isn't to make people believe a particular story. The objective, and again, Phil, you've talked about this, the objective I see is to make people just not able to believe any story, that you can cast doubt on anything. Our ability to believe in any objective ground truth gets damaged. For me as a journalist, that's a terrifying prospect because I deal in ground truth. I try and publish ground truth. So again, this issue of trust just comes up again and again and again in these conversations. And as I say, it's been in the dark web really from the beginning. It's in its DNA.
Wonderful. Thank you. Does anybody want to offer a question or some quick feedback?
I was just thank you for that, Geoff. I was very interested in how escrow has played a role in that trust situation. So we've seen sort of number of sites now creating financial commitment that people make as a way of showing that they've literally got some skin in the game. How do you view that as a trust mechanism?
It's been really interesting, and escrow was pioneered, I believe, I'm right in saying escrow was pioneered by Silk Road. They had a system whereby you paid your money into a central pot, and if the person who was looking to receive the goods or service didn't receive it, then they wouldn't have to pay. They would get their money refunded from the pot. Again, it was a key tool in a lot of the post Silk Road sites. Again, I've mentioned Alphabay and Hansa and Hydra Market and so on. This idea of an escrow system, and actually, I did. As a test purchase, I did carry out a test purchase on one of the sites and sure enough paid into the escrow system, and the person at the other end unsurprisingly let me down. And the person who administrated the site, I got in touch with them and said, oh, I've been ripped off. What are you going to do about this? And I got a message back from the administrator saying, well, we're very sorry about this. You know, we've taken the money out of the escrow, we'll refund it to you. We've blacklisted this particular member. So it was the objective was to kind of offer a public service. But again, what was driving all of that was trust. How can we get our users to trust it? The problem, of course, with the escrow was that when people paid into a central pot, you could have, as we saw in a lot of cases, exit scams, where the person who runs the dark website takes the money and runs. And of course, you can't go to your local trading standards officer and complain that the dark website where you were going to buy your drugs has been closed down and the person who run it's buggered off. So people had issues. So again, the trust ebb and flow back and forth on escrow has been really interesting for me.
Have you heard of any cases where the dark web or even encrypted apps like Telegram have been exploited or hacked in a way? I mean, I guess technically speaking, if you own more than 50% of the nodes, you can kind of start to look at who's behind it. Or on Telegram, if you own the telco, like the Russian government, you could, you know, retrieve your password that way and get into accounts.
It's interesting. There's constant chatter about vulnerabilities in the apps, vulnerabilities in the Tor software, the software that runs dark websites and so on. But again, Britton will attest to this. From my experience of law enforcement activity around these things, it's a very tough nut to crack, the encryption, and it's a moving target. So it's a tough moving nut to crack, if you like. Often law enforcement are going after the fleshy vulnerability, the people who actually use these. Time and time again, it's been, as it was in the case of Alphabet, as it was in the case of Hansa, I believe in both of those cases, it was people mistakes that actually let it down. Again, Silk Road, there was a sort of combination of some technical work that was done around the site, that it showed some technical vulnerabilities, but also a certain amount of social engineering, in that law enforcement was trying to, in the classic way they have with organized crime, to penetrate these organizations by finding somebody a low-hanging piece of fruit, turning them, going one up the level, trying to turn somebody else, and gradually infiltrating the organization, which is what they've done, organized crime around drug gangs and so on. Britton, am I right? Is that generally speaking how it's gone? I think the mix of technical and social engineering seems to be the way, I guess.
I think you're spot on. The dark web is not unlike any community where we live. It's made up of people, and people are what make these cases. Somebody who's disgruntled because they made a purchase and somebody ran off with their money, or somebody who's just on the dark web, curious what's out there, and stumbles upon a child pornography website, and they contact us and make us known to that. So it's that human piece that is absolutely critical. And no matter how good the technology gets, if people are involved with it, that's the biggest vulnerability.
Interesting. Well, let's hear from James now, where we have another 7 or 8 minutes together, and then we can take a break and move to Q&A. James, what are you working on? You work between business and government, right, on the dark side?
Yeah, so I have a history. I've worked in cybersecurity for about 20 years. I've had my most recent 9 years has been focused in the commercial sector. And I've been really interested in how online information affects the security of organizations. And inevitably, part of that journey has led to understanding how criminal behavior on the internet influences the security of organizations. It's really interesting, this term dark web. I think, it's in the common vernacular now. We all generally use it either to refer to online criminality or to refer to software that's used to enhance privacy or anonymity, such as Tor. But we should recognize there are other types of software, and a number have been mentioned on here already. So things like the Invisible Internet Project, for example, or GNU-net, who all have sort of ways to publish websites which have privacy and anonymity enhancing qualities about them. And if you go and look at Tor, it's very interesting. There's 80,000 hidden services or websites on the Tor network, and you can go and find this for yourself by looking at metrics.torproject.org. And of those 80,000, I really think it's just a very small number, perhaps a numbering in under the 1,000, which are sort of focused on predominantly criminal activity. And you'll find some really legitimate sites like the BBC News website or Facebook. You can go and visit on Tor nodes. So I think that point has been made by the other speakers, but I think it's very interesting to see that the focus is really on that criminal activity for companies like us. We're trying to understand that in a bit more depth. In terms of stories, sort of the interesting things we've been looking at recently are, I've been intrigued by how the cyber criminal ecosystems have evolved in this environment. And really from the early days of Silk Road through to sort of the modern day forums that we see today. In particular, we saw with ransomware attacks, a number of you'll be familiar with over the years used to sort of develop software, develop capabilities by different groups sort of collaborating on some of these forums, and that would produce a ransomware, and then that would be franchised out to operators. So the people committing the crime are actually people who've benefited from the franchise, not the originators of the original software. And we saw that sort of grow. We saw, unfortunately, in particular the municipal sector in the US, we saw people starting to pay those ransoms. And we saw that, in fact, creating a market. directly, which is not a great outcome if you're trying to reduce crime online. So you saw insurers paying out the sort of ransoms because it was cheaper to pay the ransom than to restore the network than it was to try and sort of prosecute the criminal and live with the outage that you had from the software. So I think that's quite sad. It's a problem, and we've been trying very hard to make sure that we don't add to that problem as we go. And I think, in fact, the ethics side of this is very important. You don't want to, through your research, perpetuate crime or create payments that might then cause further problems. So it's really, really important to have a very balanced approach to that. And I've welcomed some of the advice that the Department of Justice provided in the US in this space in February this year to investigators and online investigators in this space. But a very interesting sort of recent case study. I worked on some of this ransomware recently produced by a gang called the Sodinikibi gang, so the Russian gang, also a Russian-speaking gang, should be very clear about that, who were on a particular forum, who broke into a financial services company over the Christmas period and leaked, not only did the ransom, but also stole the data and then sold that data online. And they were very successful in doing that. They managed to make a sale. It was one bid, so it approached a good price for them. And it was very interesting to see that success of that campaign then led to further activities to both deploy some ransomware, but also steal the data that the ransomware where that ransomware was deployed, and then go on and sell that data. So you get two hits in this crime. And we've seen that become a franchise model on some of the forums, so things like Exploit and XSS. We've been tracking actors directly on those doing this. And unfortunately, this is becoming now a theme. We've gone from ransomware to breach ransomware, which is not a trend that I wanted to see, but is unfortunately a growing one. Now we regularly have customers contacting us where their data has been offered because some computer somewhere on their network has had a compromise, and then the data, not only are they unable to access that computer, but all the data on it is then offered for sale. And I think some of the solution here is, applying good intelligence techniques to this. There's a lot of creating trust amongst thieves is very hard, as Geoff was alluding to, and I think they've got some quite effective ways of doing that now. Things like escrow and putting money into the pot to prove they've got skin in the game. I think it's really interesting to see still a lot of people. A lot of the actors genuinely don't have anything to say, but will say they have it. Unwitting parties will go and procure what they think is stolen data, and actually it's not valid at all. So we spend a lot of time applying intelligence techniques to try and evaluate the source, to then put forward different hypotheses about what might be happening, and then evaluating those hypotheses so our customers get a good answer at the end of it.
James, we've only got another minute or so, and then we'll come back for Q&A shortly. But I can't tell, listening to you, whether you might think that the dark web is getting bigger or smaller, or better or worse, or just different in some way. You've all been working on these problems for a long time. James, do you have a sense of trajectory? And when we come back, we can all maybe tackle this question about whether it's better or worse.
Yeah, it's great question. Thank you, Phil. So crime is digitized. So and the amount of crime is growing because there is opportunity for criminals in digitizing crime, and they're making money without taking the same risks they used to before. So that is definitely growing. In terms of the physical size of something like Tor, I think actually it's ranged between 60 to 80,000 hidden services on the Tor network specifically. We are seeing other services like I2P and Telegram, as Geoff alluded to, start to take a role in this place. Our opinion, though, is that Tor does seem to be lasting. We actually wrote a bit of research called Forums Are Forever on this topic recently, and we still think for the next few years that they'll remain quite strong.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, this has been a great session, great conversation, and we'll come back in a few minutes for a little bit more. And of course, we'll pull some of the good questions out of the chat.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.